She wasn't supposed to see it. But she did. Lilian stood in the doorway with a food bag in her hand and her heart still full of good intentions, and what she saw on the other side of that door stopped every single thing inside her. Jessica, Jennifer, and Hyunwoo. Her two best friends. And the man she was going to marry. Her hand was still on the door handle. Her feet had not moved. Her mouth had fallen open slightly and no sound was coming out because her body had completely forgotten how to produce one. The bag of food was slipping from her fingers and she did not notice. She did not notice anything except the three people in front of her and the way the entire architecture of her life was collapsing in real time. Has this ever happened to you? Not one person betraying you, but multiple people you loved, all at once, all in the same room? Because what Lilian is looking at right now is not just a betrayal. It is a massacre. The bag hit the floor. That sound, that small, stupid sound of takeout containers hitting tile, is what broke the moment open. Hyunwoo turned first. His face did something complicated and ugly, cycling through shock and guilt and something that almost looked like calculation, like even now, caught like this, part of his brain was already looking for an exit. He said her name. He said it the way you say a word when you need it to be a full sentence, an explanation, an apology, a miracle, all at once. Lilian. Jennifer moved to cover herself and still could not look up. Could not meet Lilian's eyes. She stared at the floor the way someone stares at the floor when they have been doing something for long enough that shame has become a familiar address. Jessica was the one who looked at her. Directly. And that was somehow the worst part of all of it. Because there was guilt in Jessica's eyes, yes, but underneath the guilt there was something else. Something flat and quiet that Lilian would spend many nights afterward trying to name. It was not love. It was not regret. It was the look of someone who had already made their peace with a decision long before this moment arrived. That look told Lilian everything she needed to know about how long this had been going on. Hyunwoo stepped toward her. She stepped back. Not with drama. Not with a speech. Her body simply moved away from him the way a body moves from something that has become dangerous. He kept saying her name and she kept hearing it and it kept meaning less and less with every repetition. She looked at all three of them one final time. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence was doing everything. She turned around. She walked back down the hallway. She pressed the elevator button. She stood and waited with her arms at her sides and her face perfectly still, and when the doors opened she stepped inside and turned around and watched them close. She saw her own reflection in the metal surface. Same earrings Jessica had given her for her birthday. Same dress she had put on that morning thinking about how Hyunwoo's face would look when he saw her. She reached up and took the earrings out right there in the elevator. She held them in her fist. She did not throw them. She just held them because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. The elevator reached the ground floor. She walked out into the evening air and kept walking. No direction. No destination. Just forward, because forward was the only option that existed. She ended up in a bar she had never been to before. Low lighting. Quiet music. The kind of place where people come to be somewhere without being anywhere. She sat at the far end of the counter and she ordered something strong and she stared at her glass and she tried to understand what had just happened to her life. She was still dressed for a good day. That was the cruelest detail. She had woken up that morning and put herself together for people who were busy tearing her apart. She set Jessica's earrings on the bar counter. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she pushed them to the far edge like she was moving a piece off a board. Whoever they are, said a voice nearby, they're not worth what's on your face right now. She turned. The man a few seats down was Korean. Quietly dressed in the way of someone who has nothing to prove. He wasn't leaning in or performing interest. He was simply sitting with the relaxed stillness of a man who was very comfortable taking up space without making noise about it. He looked at her steadily, without rushing, the way people look when they are genuinely observant and genuinely unbothered. She almost didn't answer. She was not looking for conversation. She was not looking for anything except the bottom of her glass. But something about the way he said it stopped her. It wasn't a line. It wasn't flattery dressed as concern. It was just a true thing, said plainly, by someone who didn't seem to need anything from her response. You have no idea, she said. You don't have to tell me, he replied. But I'm here. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her glass. Then, because she had nobody left to call, because Jessica and Jennifer had her contacts and Hyunwoo had her trust and all three of them had used what she gave them to build something behind her back, she started talking. She told him everything. Not the clean version. The real version, still raw and unedited, with the edges still sharp. The relationship. The key Hyunwoo pressed into her palm 8 months ago like it was a vow. The food she carried across the city as a surprise. The earrings on the bar counter. The look on Jessica's face. The way Jennifer couldn't even look at her. He listened. He did not rush to fix it or reframe it or silver lining it. He just listened, all the way to the end, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said something that reached directly into the most protected part of her chest and cracked it open. The worst part is not even what they did. It's realizing that what you thought you had was never fully real. And you have to grieve something that was already gone before you even knew to hold on to it. Her eyes filled. She had not cried once since she walked out of that apartment. She had been too numb, too composed, too busy just surviving the next 30 seconds. But those words found the exact wound she had been guarding and she felt something in her give way completely. She didn't cry loudly. She was too proud for that. But she let herself feel it, finally, in this bar with this stranger, and he sat with her in it without trying to move her through it faster than she was ready to go. The night stretched. The drinks kept coming. The conversation moved, slowly, from pain into something else, something lighter, something that surprised her. She laughed once, at something he said, and the sound of it caught her off guard. He looked at her when she laughed like it was the most interesting thing he had seen all evening. She did not plan what happened after that. She needs you to know that. She was not that kind of woman. She was the kind of woman who bought food as a surprise and treated a key like a promise and loved people without keeping score. But that woman had just had everything taken from her in a single evening. And this man, Kang Jaewon, she would learn his name later, was present and warm and steady in a way that the night was demanding, and for a few hours she did not want to be careful or sensible or responsible. She just needed to feel something that was not grief. And before you judge her, walk a mile in those shoes first. She lost her fiancé and her two best friends in the same room on the same night. What would you have done? She woke up to unfamiliar curtains and pale morning light and the slow, assembling memory of the night before. He was already awake. Sitting up, looking across the room at nothing, in the easy way of a man who is comfortable inside his own silence. When he noticed she was awake he looked at her and they held that look, two people who had not planned any of this, regarding each other in the quiet of a morning that neither of them had seen coming. I don't do this, she said. I know, he said. Simply. Like he believed her without needing her to prove it. They parted without promises or pretending. She walked out into the morning city and the air hit her face and she kept moving, one foot then the other, the same way she had walked out of that apartment building the night before. She had lost everything. She had no fiancé. No best friends. No home she could go back to without it feeling like a crime scene. But she was still standing. Still breathing. And somewhere underneath all the wreckage, something very small and very stubborn was refusing to lie down. She just had to figure out what came next. Wreckage, something very small and very stubborn was refusing to lie down. She just had to figure out what came next. She told herself it was just a job. She lied. The first week after everything fell apart was the quietest Lilian had ever lived. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet you choose on a slow Sunday morning with tea and no obligations. This was the quiet of a life that had been suddenly emptied. The quiet of reaching for your phone to call someone and remembering you had no one to call. The quiet of an apartment that used to feel like a home and now just felt like a space she was borrowing from a version of herself that no longer existed. She had moved out of the place she shared with Hyunwoo within 3 days. She had not cried while she packed. She had been very methodical about it, folding things carefully, labeling boxes, moving with the focused energy of a woman who knew that if she slowed down for even a moment she would sit on the floor and not get back up. She found a small place across the city. Affordable. Nothing special. 4 walls and a window that faced another building. It was fine. It was hers. That was enough for now. She blocked Hyunwoo on everything. That part was easy. Anger has a way of making certain decisions very clean and very simple. Jessica and Jennifer were harder. Not because she forgave them. She did not. But because they were woven into so much of her daily life that removing them felt like surgery. Shared playlists. Saved restaurant recommendations. Inside jokes that would now always carry the aftertaste of what she knew. She did not block them immediately. She just went silent. Stopped responding. Let the threads hang. She was not ready to cut them and she was not ready to pull them either. She just needed them to stop existing in her immediate line of vision while she figured out how to breathe again. The money situation was not patient with her grief. Lilian had been between jobs when she and Hyunwoo were together, taking her time, not rushing because she had felt secure. That security was gone now and the bills were not interested in her timeline. She updated her resume. She applied everywhere that made sense and some places that didn't. She went to interviews and smiled and answered questions and came home to her empty apartment and waited. Nothing came through fast enough. And then she remembered something. Weeks before everything collapsed, Jessica had mentioned a company. A good one, she had said. Well-paying, sleek offices, the kind of place that actually had a future in it. She had said there was a personal assistant position opening up and that she could put in a word. At the time Lilian had been half listening, comfortable and unhurried, not thinking she would need it. She needed it now. She sat with the idea for 2 full days. The thought of walking into the same building as Jessica and Jennifer every morning turned her stomach. The thought of being that close to people who had looked her in the face for what must have been months, knowing what they were doing, smiling the same smiles, answering her calls, it made something hot and tight rise up in her chest. But the rent was due. And pride, she was learning, was a luxury that required a financial cushion she no longer had. She applied. She did not tell them she had applied. She submitted her resume through the official channel and she got a response within 48 hours and an interview scheduled for the following Monday. She wore her best outfit to that interview. She walked in with her shoulders back and her chin level and she answered every question with the calm and competence of a woman who had absolutely nothing falling apart behind her eyes. She got the job before she made it back home. Personal assistant to the company's director. She told herself it was just a job. A means to an end. She would be professional, she would be excellent, she would keep her head down and save money and build herself back up from the ground. Jessica and Jennifer were just co-workers now. People she shared a building with. Nothing more. She told herself all of this very firmly and she almost believed it. The office was everything Jessica had described. Clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, the particular kind of organized energy that comes from a company that is both serious and successful. Lilian walked in on her first morning and let herself appreciate it for exactly 30 seconds before switching into focus mode. She found her desk. She reviewed the schedule she had been sent. She introduced herself to the people who introduced themselves to her. She was warm and professional and completely in control. She saw Jennifer first, across the open floor near the printer stations. Jennifer saw her at the same moment. The air between them did something uncomfortable. Jennifer's mouth opened slightly like she might say something and then closed again. Lilian held the eye contact for exactly 1 second, long enough to communicate that she had seen her, that she was not afraid, and that she was not interested, and then she looked back at her screen and did not look up again. She saw Jessica an hour later near the coffee station. Jessica actually took a small step toward her, something flashing across her face that might have been relief or guilt or both. Lilian picked up her coffee, turned, and walked back to her desk without acknowledging her at all. She was not ready to have that conversation. She might never be ready to have that conversation. But she was here, and she was working, and she was not going to let either of them shake what little ground she had managed to build. She was deep in her first task, organizing the director's calendar for the following month, when the energy in the office shifted. She noticed it before she understood it. People straightening slightly. Conversations dropping half a register. A particular kind of alertness moving through the room like a current. She looked up from her screen. He was walking through the main floor toward the director's office. Unhurried. Not performing authority but radiating it anyway, the way certain people do, the way it comes from something internal rather than something performed. Dark suit. Quiet confidence. The particular stillness of a man who had never needed a room's attention and therefore always had it. Lilian's brain processed the visual in pieces. The walk. The posture. The way he held himself. And then it caught up all at once. She knew that stillness. She knew the way he occupied a space like he had always been meant to be in it. She knew the line of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes and the way he moved like noise was beneath him. Her stomach dropped completely through the floor. No. He reached the door of the director's office and paused, and in that pause he turned his head, unhurriedly, the way he did everything, and his eyes found hers across the floor. Kang Jaiwan. The man from the bar. The stranger who had sat with her in her worst night and said the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. The man she had spent the night with and walked away from in the pale morning light of a hotel room, telling herself it was a closed chapter. Her boss. Wait. Can you imagine? You pour your heart out to a stranger, you spend the night, you walk away thinking you will never see him again, and he is sitting in the director's chair of the only job you could get? I cannot. Comment asterisk nope, if this would have you walking straight back out of that building. Loudly crying face. For a moment neither of them moved. Then his expression did something very subtle. Not shock exactly, or rather, shock controlled so quickly and so completely that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it. His eyes held hers for 2 seconds, 3, and then something behind them went very still and very composed. He looked away first. He stepped into his office. The door did not slam. It closed quietly, with the precise click of a man who does not betray himself through his actions. Lilian turned back to her screen. Her hands were in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed slowly through her nose and stared at the calendar in front of her without seeing a single thing on it. She had told this man things she had not told anyone. She had sat in a bar in her best dress with her heart wide open and she had handed him every vulnerable and broken piece of herself because she thought he was a stranger she would never see again. She had thought it was a night that belonged only to itself, sealed off from the rest of her life. It was not sealed. It was sitting in the office 12 feet away from her desk. She was going to need a moment. She did not get a moment. Her phone buzzed. A message from the office system, routed from the director's office to her desk. My schedule for this afternoon needs to be rearranged. Come in when you're ready. She read it twice. She straightened her jacket. She stood up. She picked up her notepad and her pen and she walked across the floor to his office door and she knocked once. Come in, he said. She opened the door. He was behind his desk, looking at his screen, and he looked up when she entered with the exact same composed, unhurried expression he wore for everything. Like she was simply his new personal assistant. Like the bar had never happened. Like the hotel room was from a different lifetime that had nothing to do with either of them standing in this room right now. She matched him. She would not be the one to crack first. You needed the schedule rearranged, she said. Yes, he said. Sit down. She sat. She opened her notepad. She clicked her pen. And the two of them proceeded to have the most professionally composed meeting of her entire life, conducted entirely over the surface of something neither of them was going to be the first to name. A month passed. Lilian learned the rhythms of the office the way you learn the layout of a new city, carefully at first, then automatically, until one day you stop thinking about where you are going and just arrive. She learned which meetings ran long and which clients needed extra handling. She learned that Kang Jaiwan took his coffee without sugar and his calls standing up and his silence seriously. She learned that the version of him the office saw, composed, precise, quietly authoritative, was not a performance exactly, but it was also not the whole picture. She was good at her job. Better than good. She was the kind of assistant who anticipated rather than waited, who solved problems before they became problems, who made the complicated machinery of a busy man's professional life run so smoothly that he barely had to think about the mechanics of it. She knew this about herself. She had always been competent. It was one of the few things the last several weeks had not been able to take from her. Kang Jaiwan noticed. He did not say so in so many words. But she could tell by the way the temperature of their professional interactions shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way seasons change, gradually and then all at once. He gave her more responsibility. He included her in briefings that went beyond the usual scope of a personal assistant. When she made a recommendation he listened to it, actually listened, not the performative listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak but the real kind. The kind that meant something. They did not talk about the bar. It existed between them like furniture in a dark room. Neither of them walked into it directly but both of them were always aware of exactly where it was. Jessica and Jennifer watched all of this. Lilian was not naive enough to think they hadn't noticed. She had felt their eyes on her from the first day, tracking the quiet evolution of her relationship with Kang Jaiwan with an attention that had nothing to do with idle curiosity. She ignored it the way she ignored most things in that office that were not her direct responsibility. She had not spoken to either of them beyond what professional necessity demanded. A nod in the hallway. A one-word answer when directly addressed. She kept the wall up and she kept it clean and she did not give either of them a gap to slide through. But she was beginning to notice other things. Small things, the way small things always are before they become impossible to ignore. The way Jessica and Jennifer moved through the office together, easy, instinctive, finishing each other's sentences in the break room, sharing looks across meeting tables that carried entire conversations in a single glance. She had seen that closeness her whole friendship with them and she had always assumed she was part of it. That she was included in whatever the warmth between them was. Watching them now from the outside, with fresh eyes and no investment in a particular version of the story, she saw something different. They were a unit. A complete one. Two people who had built something sturdy and self-contained between them that did not actually require a third person to function. She had always been around them, always present, always showing up, always loving loudly. But she was starting to understand, slowly and painfully, that presence is not the same as belonging. That being in the room is not the same as being in the circle. She had been outside that circle for years without knowing it. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the way the truth usually comes when you have been avoiding it for a long time. A memory would surface, a plan that had changed last minute, an inside joke she had never been let in on, a conversation that stopped when she walked into a room and resumed a different shape after she sat down, and she would look at it with new eyes and understand it differently than she had at the time. She had not lost a friendship the night she walked into that apartment. She had finally just seen clearly what had always been there. That understanding hurt in a way that was different from the initial betrayal. The initial betrayal was sharp and loud and violent in its clarity. This was quieter. More sustained. The grief of realizing that the thing you mourned was not the thing you thought it was. That you had loved something real on your side that was only partially real on theirs. She was the third wheel. She had always been the third wheel. And she had been too busy loving them to see it. She was working late on a Thursday when Kang Jaiwan came out of his office and found her still at her desk. Most of the floor had emptied out an hour ago. The cleaning staff moved quietly in the background. She had her head down over a document, a half-eaten container of food pushed to the side, her jacket thrown over the back of her chair. He stopped when he saw her. "You're still here." "So are you," she said, without looking up. A pause. Then he crossed the floor and sat down in the chair across from her desk, which he had never done before, and she looked up because the action was unusual enough to warrant it. He looked at her the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Like he was reading something. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "I'm always professional," she said carefully. "That's not what I said." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at him properly for the first time in weeks outside of a work context, and something in her loosened slightly, the way it does when you have been holding your posture for too long and someone finally gives you permission to breathe. "I've just been figuring some things out," she said. "About the job?" "About everything else." He nodded slowly, like that answer was sufficient. He did not push. That was one of the things she had learned about him over the past month. He never pushed. He created space and let you decide what to do with it. It was an unusual quality in a man who was, by all professional accounts, someone people did not say no to. They sat in the quiet of the emptying office for a moment. "The two women on the third floor," he said. Not a question exactly. More like a careful placement of words. "You know them." She went still. "They referred you," he continued. "I noticed that when you were hired." "I didn't say anything." She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, unreadable expression, but underneath it there was something attentive. Something that was waiting to understand rather than waiting to respond. "Yes," she said. "I know them. And they are the ones from the bar." It was not a question this time either. He had put it together, she didn't know when, didn't know how much he had assembled from what she had told him that night, but he had arrived at the truth and he was laying it on the table between them without drama or accusation. She exhaled slowly. "Yes." Something shifted in his expression. Barely visible. The kind of shift that in another man might have been anger, but in him was something colder and more deliberate. He did not say anything immediately. He looked across the office floor, quiet, and she watched him process the information with the contained stillness of someone who was deciding something rather than reacting to something. "You should have told me," he said finally. "It wasn't relevant to the job." "It's relevant to me." The words landed quietly, but they landed. She looked at him and he looked back at her, and for a moment the professional surface of everything they had built over the past month was thinner than usual, and she could see something underneath it that she had been carefully not looking at directly. She did not know what to do with Kang Jaewon. That was the honest truth of it. She had walked into this job trying to survive, not trying to feel anything, and somewhere between the schedule rearrangements and the late nights and the careful dance of two people who knew more about each other than their professional relationship was supposed to allow, something had begun to grow in the space between them that she did not have a clean name for yet. She was not ready to name it. She was barely ready to acknowledge it existed. But she was aware of it. Constantly. Like a room in her chest that had a light on. He started doing small things. Not grand gestures. Nothing that could be pointed to directly and labeled. A better office chair appeared at her desk without comment. When a client spoke to her dismissively in a meeting, Kang Jaewon redirected the conversation with a precision that was so smooth it could have been accidental, but she knew it wasn't. When she worked late, he stayed without making a production of it. When she got something exactly right, and she did, often, he would look at her with a quiet satisfaction that felt more personal than professional. He was watching out for her. Without asking for credit. Without making her feel managed or handled. Just quietly, consistently, putting himself between her and anything that came too close. She noticed every single thing. She said nothing. But she noticed. Jessica noticed too. Lilian became aware of it gradually and then with uncomfortable clarity. Jessica's eyes following her across rooms. A comment made too casually to a colleague, loud enough to carry, something about Lilian being new, about people who moved too fast, about professionalism. The kind of commentary that was designed to sound general and land specific. Jennifer was more subtle, but the energy was the same. Little undermining moments. A deadline that Lilian hadn't been informed about until the last minute. A meeting that somehow didn't make it onto her calendar. Small enough to be deniable. consistent enough to be intentional. They were not remorseful. That became clear. Whatever guilt had lived in their expressions on that first day in the office had not grown into anything useful. What had grown instead was something that looked very much like resentment. As if Lilian's refusal to crumble, her quiet competence, her proximity to the most powerful person in the building, as if all of it was an offense they had not signed up for. She had lost everything, rebuilt herself from nothing, walked into the same building as the two people who had helped destroy her life, and she was still standing. Still excellent. Still moving forward. And they could not stand it. She was in the break room alone when Jessica came in. Jennifer was a few steps behind her, which told Lilian this was not accidental. She kept her eyes on her coffee cup and her expression neutral, and she waited. "You look comfortable," Jessica said. Her voice was light in the way voices get when they are carrying something heavy underneath. "I'm making coffee," Lilian said. "You know what I mean." Lilian looked up then. She looked at Jessica fully, the way she had been avoiding doing for weeks, and she took in the expression on her face, the tightness around the eyes, the set of the mouth, the particular energy of someone who has come somewhere with a purpose. "Say what you came to say," Lilian said quietly. Jessica and Jennifer exchanged a look. That look, the private fluent language of their closed circle, that look that had always excluded her without her knowing it. "We're just saying," Jennifer started. "Be careful," Jessica finished. "With Jaiwan. You don't know what you're getting into." Lilian was quiet for a moment. "You're giving me advice. We're looking out for you. Like you always have." The words fell flat and sharp at the same time. Jessica's expression flickered. Jennifer looked away. Lilian picked up her coffee. She looked at both of them one more time, these two women she had loved for years, these two women who had made her believe she had a circle when she had always been standing just outside of it, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Something quieter and more final than either. "I'm good," she said. She walked out of the break room and back to her desk, and she sat down and she opened her work, and she did not think about them for the rest of the day. But she thought about Kang Jaiwan. She thought about a man who had sat with her in the worst night of her life and asked for nothing. Who had given her back to herself in the morning without making her feel like she owed him the gesture. Who had watched her rebuild herself from the inside of the same building and had said nothing about what he was doing when he quietly, consistently made sure the ground beneath her was a little more stable. She thought about the light in that room in her chest. She was almost ready to open the door. It happened on a Wednesday. Lilian had learned that the most significant moments of her life never announced themselves in advance. The morning she walked into Hyenwa's apartment, she had been thinking about dumplings. The night she met Kang Jaiwan, she had been thinking about survival. And the Wednesday everything finally came to a head, she had been thinking about a quarterly report that needed to be on Jaiwan's desk before noon. She was walking through the third-floor corridor with a folder under her arm when Jessica stepped out of a conference room directly into her path. Jennifer was behind her. The door clicked shut. The corridor was empty in both directions. Lilian stopped. She looked at both of them. She waited. "We need to talk," Jessica said. "I don't think we do." Lilian. Jennifer's voice had something in it that might have been an attempt at sincerity. "We have been trying to give you space, but this has gone on long enough and we need to clear the air." Lilian looked at her. "Clear the air," she repeated. "Yes. What happened, what you saw, it's complicated. And we know you're angry, but you've been freezing us out for weeks and we work in the same building and it's becoming uncomfortable." Lilian offered. Jennifer stopped. "Yes. For you." Neither of them answered. Which was its own answer. Lilian shifted the folder under her arm and looked at both of them with the calm of a woman who had already lived through the worst of this and was therefore not afraid of the conversation. She had cried for these women. She had grieved the friendship. She had spent nights pulling apart years of memories and reassembling them with the new information she had been given, and she had come out the other side of that process with a very clear picture of what had existed and what had not. She was not angry anymore. That was the thing. The anger had burned clean weeks ago and left something cooler and clearer in its place. I'm not frozen out, she said. I'm just done. Jessica's expression shifted. Something in it sharpened. Done, she repeated, like the word tasted wrong. Yes. Because of one mistake. Lilian looked at her. One. Things happen. Feelings happen. It wasn't planned. How long? Lilian asked. Her voice was even. Conversational almost. Jessica went quiet. How long had it been going on? Lilian asked again. Because I've been thinking about it and I don't think it was once. I don't think it was recent. I think it had been going on long enough that all three of you were comfortable. Long enough that it became normal. So I'm asking you directly. How long? The silence that followed was its own confession. Jennifer looked at the floor. Jessica looked at a point past Lilian's shoulder, that same look, the flat, already decided look that Lilian had seen in the doorway of Hyenwa's apartment, the look that had haunted her more than the image itself. That's what I thought, Lilian said quietly. You want to act like you're perfect, Jessica said, and now the lightness in her voice was gone entirely. Something harder had replaced it. Like you were this perfect friend and we just destroyed everything for no reason. I never said I was perfect. You didn't have to. You've always made us feel like we owed you something. Always showing up, always doing too much, always making everything about how much you love people. It's exhausting, Lilian. It was always exhausting. The words were designed to wound. Lilian could see the architecture of them, the way Jessica had built them to find the most vulnerable entry point, to take the very things that made Lilian who she was and reframe them as flaws, as burdens, as things to be ashamed of. She felt them land. She would not pretend otherwise. There was a sharp intake somewhere in her chest, a small flinch that she did not let reach her face. But she did not break. So loving people too much is the reason you slept with my fiancé, she said. That's the logic. Jessica opened her mouth. Don't, Lilian said. Quietly. Firmly. I'm not doing this with you. Not because it hurts and not because I'm afraid of it. Because I already know everything I need to know and this conversation has nothing left to give me. She looked at Jennifer, who had still not fully met her eyes. I spent years showing up for both of you. Genuinely. Without keeping score. And you were never really mine to show up for. That's fine. People are allowed to grow closer to each other than they are to a third person. But you could have just been honest. You could have let the friendship fade the way friendships sometimes do. Instead you smiled and called and pretended right up until I found out the hardest possible way. Jennifer's jaw tightened. Something that might have been shame moved across her face briefly. That's the part one won't forgive, Lilian continued. Not the feelings, not even what you did. The pretending. The years of pretending. She adjusted the folder under her arm. I have a report to deliver, she said. Excuse me. She walked between them and down the corridor and she did not look back once. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached Jaiwan's office. She stopped outside the door and pressed one palm flat against the wall and breathed. In through the nose. Out slowly. She gave herself 60 seconds to feel it, the sting of Jessica's words, the confirmation of everything she had suspected, the strange grief of a door finally closing all the way, and then she straightened, knocked, and walked in. Jaiwan was on a call. He held up one finger without looking up. She set the report on his desk and turned to leave. Lilian. She stopped. He was off the call. He was looking at her with that particular attentiveness, the kind that missed nothing, and she realized her composure was not as complete as she had thought. Something was showing. She didn't know what exactly. But he could see it. Sit down, he said. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. Sit down. She sat. He came around from behind his desk, which he rarely did, and he leaned against the front of it with his arms loosely crossed, and he looked at her in the way he had in the break room weeks ago, reading something, taking his time, not rushing toward a conclusion. "They finally said it," he said. She looked up at him. "You knew?" "I've been watching them for weeks. I know how people behave when they're trying to destabilize someone." A pause. "I know what it looks like when it's working and when it isn't." "It wasn't working," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. But that doesn't mean it didn't cost you something." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had appeared in the worst night of her life and somehow kept appearing. Who had watched her rebuild herself from 12 feet away and had quietly, without announcement, made sure the ground was stable enough to build on. Who asked her nothing, demanded nothing, performed nothing, and was simply and consistently present in a way that had become, without her fully deciding to let it, one of the things she relied on most. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About them," she meant. "About Jessica and Jennifer." "What I should have done when I put the full picture together," he said simply. "Jaiwan. They've been deliberately interfering with your work. That's a professional matter regardless of the personal history." He looked at her steadily. "I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because it is the right call." She almost smiled at that. Because of course that was how he would say it. Jaiwan never did anything for sentimental reasons, or at least he would never say so. He wrapped every human thing he did in the language of logic and necessity. She had learned to read underneath the language to the thing it was actually carrying. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. The room was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the same even tone he used for everything, "You are the strongest person in this building. I want you to know that I see that. Even when you don't." She felt her throat tighten. She looked at her hands. She had not expected that. He rarely said the thing directly. She had grown accustomed to receiving everything from him in the indirect form, reading it through actions and small moments and the way he positioned himself between her and things that came too close. This was direct. And it landed somewhere deep. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady but only just. He nodded once, like the conversation was complete, and moved back behind his desk. She stood and gathered herself and walked toward the door. "Lilian." She turned. He was looking at her from behind his desk with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something open in it. Something that had lowered the careful composure just enough to let her see what was underneath. "After work," he said. "Dinner." "Not as colleagues." She looked at him. He looked back. Waiting, in his unhurried way, giving her the space to decide, the same way he had been giving her space to decide everything since the night at the bar when he had said, "You don't have to tell me, but I'm here." She thought about the woman who had stood frozen in a doorway not so long ago, holding a bag of food she had bought as a surprise for people who were busy betraying her. She thought about the elevator. The earrings on the bar counter. The empty apartment and the job applications and the long weeks of rebuilding something out of nothing, quietly, stubbornly, one day at a time. She thought about who she was now compared to who she had been then. The difference was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was solid. It was earned. It was hers in a way that nothing could take from her because she had built it herself from the rubble of everything she lost. She smiled. Slowly. The real kind, the kind that reaches the eyes. "What time?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Subtle, controlled, but there, the warmth of a man who did not often let himself want things and had just been told he could have this one. "7, he said. "I'll be ready," she said. She walked out of the office and back to her desk and she sat down and she opened her work and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Jessica and Jennifer were called into a meeting with HR before the end of the day. Their conduct over the past several weeks, the withheld information, the deliberately missed calendar entries, the subtle campaign to undermine a colleague, had been noted and documented with the quiet thoroughness of a man who missed nothing and acted when the moment was right. They did not come back to the office the following morning. Lilian found out the way she found out most things at the company now, efficiently, without drama, as a simple fact she filed and moved past. She did not celebrate. She did not feel guilty. She felt the clean, uncomplicated closure of a chapter that had taken far too long to end. She was at her desk at 8 in the morning, excellent at her job, unbothered, whole. Dinner was quiet and honest in the way that things between them had always eventually become. They sat across from each other in a restaurant that was warm and unhurried, and they talked, not about work, not about the bar, not about the complicated architecture of how they had arrived at this table. They talked the way two people talk when they are finally allowing themselves to just be in the same space without managing the distance between them. He was, as she had suspected from the very beginning, more than what he showed the world. Not softer exactly. Just fuller. There was humor in him that he deployed rarely and therefore precisely. There was a quality of attention he gave her that made her feel like the most considered person in any room. He was a man who had clearly spent a long time being surrounded by people who wanted things from him and had therefore become very selective about who he let close. She understood that. She had spent a long time being surrounded by people who were not who they said they were and had therefore become careful about where she placed her trust. They were, she thought, looking at him across the table in the warm light of a good evening, two people who had both been through enough to know what they were choosing. That knowledge made it feel solid in a way that the excitement of something new sometimes doesn't. She was not falling. She had already fallen, quietly and in stages, over weeks of late nights and small moments and the particular warmth of being consistently seen. What this dinner was the decision to stop pretending otherwise. They left the restaurant and walked for a while, no particular direction, just the city at night and the easy silence of people who have moved past the need to fill every pause. At some point he took her hand and she let him, and they kept walking. She thought about everything she had lost. The fiancé who had not been who she believed him to be. The friends who had never really been hers. The version of herself who had loved without looking, trusted without questioning, given without wondering if she was building on real ground. She did not miss that version of herself. She had needed her, she had been her, she had learned everything she needed to learn from living inside her. But she was gone now, that woman, and what was here instead was sharper and clearer and quieter in the best possible way. Strong. Not because nothing could hurt her. But because she had been hurt and had not let it make her smaller. That was the thing about losing everything. When you rebuilt, you got to decide what went back in and what didn't. You got to choose more carefully. You got to build something that was actually yours. She had her job. She had her self-respect. She had ground beneath her feet that she had laid herself, brick by brick, in the months since a doorway had shown her the truth about her life. And she had this, the city at night and a man beside her who had appeared in her worst moment and had, without either of them entirely planning it, become one of the best things in her life. Lilian was not the woman in the doorway anymore. She had walked through it. And everything on the other side was hers. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Lilian's journey is for every woman who has ever loved too freely and been taken for granted, who has ever stood in a moment of devastating clarity and had to decide what to do with the truth. She chose herself. Every single time. And that is why she gets everything at the end. If this story moved you, share it. If you saw yourself in Lilian, comment below. And if you want more stories like this on the Afro Korea channel, let us know, because there are more women like Lilian whose stories deserve to be told. Blackheart.